The bear slept beside his bed every night, but after he died, what the bear did shocked everyone. The old farmhouse stood on the edge of a quiet valley, surrounded by fields that once thrived with crops but now lay in gentle silence. Its owner, Henry, was a man in his late 70s who had lived there his whole life. Once he had a family, a wife who passed too soon, and a son who moved away to the city, never to return. Over the years, Henry grew accustomed to silence. His days passed slowly, tending the garden, sitting on the porch, or listening to the wind rustling through the trees. But the nights were the hardest. When the sun sank behind the hills and the farmhouse grew dark, Henry felt the full weight of loneliness. He often sat in his wooden chair by the window, staring out at the endless forest that stretched beyond his land, wondering if anyone, or anything, might remember him when he was gone. One stormy evening, as rain poured down in sheets and thunder rolled through the valley, Henry heard a faint sound outside his window. At first, he thought it was just the wind. But then came a soft, trembling whimper, unlike anything he had heard before. With his lantern in hand, Henry opened the creaky door and stepped out into the rain. There, huddled against the side of the house, was a tiny bear cub. Its fur was drenched, its eyes wide with fear, and its small body shivered from the cold. Henry froze. A bear cub meant danger. Somewhere nearby, a mother bear might be searching. But as the minutes passed, no larger figure emerged from the shadows. The cub was alone. Henry's heart softened. Against all logic, he placed his lantern down, bent carefully, and whispered, "You poor thing, where's your mama?" The cub only whimpered louder, pressing closer to the wall for shelter. And in that moment, Henry's life, and the cub's, began to change forever. Henry hesitated on the porch, staring at the trembling little creature. He knew it was dangerous to get too close, yet something inside him refused to turn the cub away. The storm raged on, and he could see the cub's thin ribs through its wet fur. Hunger and fear had driven it here, and without help, it would not last the night. With a sigh, Henry opened the door wider and stepped back. "Well, come on if you've got the courage," he muttered. To his surprise, the cub didn't run. It sniffed the air cautiously, then shuffled inside, dripping water onto the wooden floor. Henry fetched an old blanket and gently draped it over the animal. The cub tensed at first but then settled, curling into the warmth. That night, Henry shared a bowl of warm milk and bread. He placed it on the floor, and the cub devoured it as though it hadn't eaten in days. Henry watched with a mixture of worry and tenderness. "Guess you needed that more than I did," he said softly. Days turned into weeks, and the cub never left. At first, Henry expected its mother to appear at any moment, but she never did. Slowly, an unspoken bond began to form. Henry spoke little, but the cub seemed to understand his moods. When Henry worked in the garden, the cub waddled behind him. When Henry sat by the fireplace, the cub curled at his feet. One night, after Henry had blown out the lamp and climbed into bed, he felt a soft thump on the floor. Peeking over the edge, he saw the cub lying there, its round eyes blinking up at him. Every night after that, the cub chose the same spot, right by his bed, as though it had decided its place was to guard him. Henry found himself smiling more often, the weight of loneliness lifting. For the first time in years, the silence of the farmhouse no longer felt empty. Without words, the two had chosen each other. And from that moment on, neither was truly alone again. As the weeks slipped into months, the cub grew stronger, its once thin frame filling out with muscle and thick, glossy fur. Henry began calling him Sam, though he never knew why. Perhaps it was just easier to name the creature who had become his constant companion, almost like family. Their nightly routine became sacred. Each evening, after Henry finished his supper, Sam would shuffle in and lay by his bed. The bear no longer whimpered or cried. Instead, he would stretch out comfortably, breathing deeply as though reassured by Henry's steady presence. Sometimes Henry reached down from the bed, brushing his fingers through the thick fur. Sam never flinched, never growled. He only sighed, the way a child might when comforted. The farmhouse felt alive again. Henry spoke more often, not because he expected answers, but because Sam listened. "You know," Henry would say, poking at the fire, "back when my wife was here, she'd scold me for leaving the tools out in the rain. You'd have liked her." Sam would tilt his head as if he understood every word. On cold nights, Henry noticed the warmth that radiated from the bear's body as it lay near the bed. It was a quiet comfort that went deeper than physical heat. For the first time in years, Henry felt safe when he closed his eyes, as if the world outside couldn't harm him while Sam kept watch. But what surprised Henry most was how the neighbors began to talk. Once or twice, someone passing by the farmhouse caught sight of the bear resting on the porch or following Henry across the field. At first, people warned him, "That thing will turn on you one day. It's in its nature." But Henry only shook his head. "He's got more kindness in him than most folks I've known," he'd reply. And he meant it. The quiet companionship between man and bear became something extraordinary, something beyond explanation. Every night, without fail, Sam curled by Henry's bed. It wasn't just loyalty, it was love, unspoken but undeniable. And though Henry never admitted it out loud, Sam had become the son he thought he had lost forever. Time flowed gently at the old farmhouse, marked by the changing of the seasons. What began as a fragile bond between a lonely man and an orphaned cub blossomed into years of unwavering devotion. Sam grew into a towering bear, his shoulders broad and his presence commanding, yet around Henry he remained gentle, as if he knew his true role wasn't that of a wild beast but of a guardian. Neighbors still shook their heads when they saw the pair walking along the fields together. Henry with his weathered hat and walking stick, and Sam lumbering behind, the size of a small horse. "One day, he'll remember he's a bear," they muttered. But Henry never doubted. He trusted Sam more than he trusted most people. Every night was the same. After supper, after the lamps were turned low and the house grew quiet, Sam padded into Henry's room and lay beside the bed. Sometimes Henry would reach down, patting his thick fur, whispering, "Good night, boy." Other nights, he'd just listen to Sam's steady breathing, a rhythm that lulled him to sleep. In the mornings, Henry often woke to find Sam still there, watching him with dark, thoughtful eyes. It was as though the bear knew how fragile Henry had become with age, and he refused to leave until he was sure his friend had made it through the night. Years passed, and Henry's back stooped lower, his steps slowed, but Sam remained at his side. The once orphaned cub had become his silent protector, filling the empty farmhouse with a sense of life and purpose. Henry sometimes wondered what fate had brought Sam to his door that stormy night so long ago. On quiet evenings, he would sit on the porch with Sam at his feet, the horizon painted gold by the setting sun. "You've given me more than I ever thought I'd have again," Henry whispered one evening, his voice catching with emotion. The bear leaned closer, resting his great head against Henry's knee. In that moment, Henry knew their bond was more than chance, it was destiny. The winters grew harsher as Henry aged, and though he tried to hide it, his body began to betray him. His hands trembled when he lifted his cup, his steps faltered on the uneven wooden floor, and his voice grew weaker with each passing season. Yet, through it all, Sam remained a constant presence. On that final winter evening, the farmhouse was cloaked in silence. A snowstorm raged outside, the wind howling through the trees as if mourning in advance. Inside, Henry lay in his bed, his breathing shallow and uneven. The old man's eyes flickered open and closed, and though he was too weak to speak, he knew what was coming. Sam entered the room quietly, his massive form casting shadows on the dim walls. He lowered himself beside the bed as he had done every night for years, pressing close as if he sensed this night was different. Henry reached out a frail hand, his fingers trembling as they brushed the bear's fur. "Good boy," he whispered, his words barely audible. "You've been my best friend." Sam let out a low rumbling sound, not a growl but a mournful hum, as though he was answering Henry's words. His dark eyes shimmered in the lamplight, reflecting a depth of emotion no one would have believed a bear could hold. As the hours slipped away, Sam never moved. He stayed pressed against the bed, his warmth wrapping around Henry like a final embrace. When Henry's breathing slowed, then ceased altogether, Sam lifted his great head and gave a sound that carried through the storm, a cry raw and heart-wrenching, that no one who heard it would ever forget. Neighbors later swore that it was unlike any bear's roar they had ever known. It was grief itself, torn from the soul of a creature who had lost his only family. That night, Sam did something no one could have imagined. Instead of leaving, he climbed onto the bed and curled his massive body beside Henry's still form. There he stayed, keeping his final vigil, as though determined to guard his friend even in death. Morning came quietly, the storm outside giving way to a pale, cold dawn. Henry's neighbors, concerned that they hadn't seen him in days, trudged through the snow to check on the old man. When they pushed open the farmhouse door, what they found left them frozen in place. There beside the bed was Sam, the massive bear who had once been an orphaned cub. His head rested gently against Henry's chest, as though still waiting for the heartbeat that would never return. His eyes were half closed, filled with a sorrow so human it silenced everyone who entered. 4 hours, Sam didn't move. He ignored the people, ignored their hushed whispers, ignored their fear. Nothing mattered now except Henry. When they tried to coax him away, Sam let out a sound, low, guttural and aching, that made them all step back. This was not a wild beast they were looking at, but a grieving soul. Finally, as the day stretched on, Sam rose. Slowly, heavily, he stepped off the bed and looked at Henry one last time. Then, in a gesture none of the witnesses would ever forget, he pressed his nose to Henry's hand, the same hand that had fed him, comforted him, and given him love when the world had abandoned him. Without another sound, Sam turned and walked out of the house. He crossed the snowy fields, his great figure disappearing into the forest beyond. None of the neighbors followed. They simply stood in silence, tears streaming down their faces, realizing they had just witnessed something far beyond their understanding. Sam was never seen again. Some said he returned to the wild where he belonged. Others believed he died not far from the farmhouse, unable to live without the man who had raised him. But for those who knew the story, one truth remained clear: their bond had been deeper than words, deeper than species, deeper than life itself. Even in death, Henry and Sam were inseparable, a reminder that love knows no boundaries, and that sometimes, the most extraordinary friendships come from the most unexpected places.